This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Derrell Peel, Oklahoma State University livestock economist, kicks off the show as he provides an overview of the market, an update on reduced packing plants, and his expectations. Today's show keeps rolling with K-State Beef Reproduction Specialist Sandy Johnson as she recaps topics from a Beef Reproduction Task Force meeting where they discussed what could be impacting successful cattle breeding. K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts ends the show explaining the life cycle of skunks, where they go in the winter, and what they commonly eat. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
You bet. Great to be with you.
Derrell, what are we seeing with the general overall cattle market view?
I tell you what, the last month has just been a whirlwind and a roller coaster ride for cattle markets. You know, we've had such a flurry of external factors affecting the markets, a lot of political stuff. That has, the beef industry and beef prices in particular have been under the spotlight as far as, national politics goes. And so we've seen a significant, I'm still going to call it a correction. It's a pretty big correction, admittedly, but it's still a correction in cattle markets, broadly speaking, because the underlying fundamentals haven't changed. And I think that's kind of the important point going forward. Certainly as we get into next year, it will be important is to remember that the cattle market is still fundamentally the same as it was about 6 weeks ago. But boy, you sure wouldn't hardly recognize it now with everything that's happened in the last month.
And with our market having a little bit more movement, not just all going up, are we still seeing record prices?
Well, not right now. We have, it is a significant correction in these markets. So we've, the initial impact of most of that political stuff comes into the futures markets. That's where it should go initially, but it does certainly spill over into cash markets. So unfortunately, cattle producers, feeder cattle producers in particular, have really taken some pretty serious hits in their revenue for those that had to market cattle in the last month, just due to these, these sort of external influences on cattle markets. So, and, at this late date, with the holidays upon us and kind of winding down for the year, as we get into December, we may well finish out the year still in the midst of all of this. I think it may take into early next year before we get past some of this. But again, I think underneath it all, the market is still fundamentally strong, and we're still expecting higher average prices in 2026.
You mentioned external influences, and are tariffs one of those?
We've had a lot of political stuff on tariffs and tariffs and trade, I guess, broadly speaking. It started about a month ago with kind of a random suggestion by the president that we might import more beef from Argentina. And that set off a fury in the industry. And it turns out that Argentina is pretty irrelevant. They represent about 2% of our beef imports. And so even if they doubled, it wouldn't really change things that much. But there were other things behind it from the, political motivation. But the point is, it set off a whole series of things after that all were related to the idea that beef prices are high. That's a politically sensitive area for the federal government. And so the beef industry has been under the microscope ever since then, with a whole series of subsequent statements related to tariffs and so on. The most recent of which is the recognition that, early in the year, Brazil was our biggest source of beef imports. And these imports are important as a source of lean processing beef that we use for our ground beef market. And so with the extra tariffs that had been on Brazil since August, now those have been removed. Some of the 10% tariff, in fact, most of the 10% tariffs across all countries that went on in April have been removed for countries that we import beef from. So there's a lot of turbulence right now trying to sort out the beef impacts. And of course, with the shutdown, we're still trying to get caught up on the trade data anyway. So all of that to say that there's just a lot of uncertainty in this whole situation right now in terms of exactly where we're at. But it's all related to kind of the focus on high beef prices and whether or not we can do anything, or anybody at the federal level could do anything to change that for consumers.
As we are seeing this correction or unknowingness in the cattle market, do you see anything then impact our other meat proteins?
The focus has been on the beef side, and interestingly enough, when people suggest beef prices are too high, the fact of the matter is consumers continue to pay that voluntarily. There's lots of other protein sources out there. People have been willing to pay for beef. Beef production is coming down, of course. We're in a situation where supplies are reduced. It's coming down in 2025, and it's going to go down farther in 2026 and 2027. The tightest supplies are ahead of us. The highest prices are ahead of us. And yet there's no real indication that it really is a demand problem. We're going to have less beef, so we're going to ration it with higher prices to find out who wants it the most. And that's the way markets are supposed to work if we just let them work.
Any concern with when we do reach those high prices about recovering and consumers who maybe got priced out of that market coming back?
There's always, I guess, a little concern with that, but I don't think so, because again, the demand hasn't changed. The ability to service all that demand is reduced because of supplies. So I would anticipate that it's going to be a couple of years before we see any real change in beef production. But I think the demand continues very strong at this point, and consumers will probably have some pent up demand to the extent that they've been had to make some changes just because of overall availability. We saw that after the pandemic in 2020 and the disruptions there. In 2021, we had a lot of pent up beef demand that played out with very strong beef prices. I think we might see something similar to that someday, but it's probably a couple of years down the road before that would happen.
What are some other effects we've seen from reduced cattle production?
Well, again, we're moving into tighter numbers continuously, and again, we haven't really started any heifer retention yet. So we know that the tightest feeder cattle supplies are ahead of us. We finally got caught up on the cattle on feed reports this last month, and so cattle on feed numbers continue to come down, and more importantly, placements and marketings, the throughput through those feedlots is coming down pretty dramatically going forward. So the cattle slaughter is reduced, which is all part of that lower beef production. And the upshot of all of that, and it's been a concern for a number of months amongst producers, is there a possibility that we could actually impact the packing industry in terms of the overall capacity or infrastructure? Tyson made an announcement recently that they were going to close the Lexington, Nebraska plant, which is one of the big mainline plants in the country, and that their Amarillo plant would go from 2 shifts to 1 for the foreseeable future. So, that's the first casualty, if you will, of the tighter cattle supplies that we're in. It might not be the last as we go forward, because we're going to be in tight cattle supplies again for 2 to 3 or 4 years going forward. So we have to wait and see.
Derrell, we continue to talk about tight cattle supplies, and is that having any effect then on research or work that's being done in the cattle industry?
Well, yeah, reduced numbers. I mean, and obviously it affects everything from, producers directly and overall production in the industry and all of the infrastructure components. We've had the border situation and the reduced cattle supplies, particularly in the Southern Plains, impacting feedlots there. And then it goes as far as looking at, things like the beef checkoff, which depends on it's directly proportional to cattle numbers in the industry. And so we see reduced support for the activities that our promotion folks do for us.
Derrell, you mentioned, and we saw a couple weeks ago, that we did see some more reports from USDA NASS. And did you see any surprises in those?
Not too much surprises in general, although we're still catching up on a lot of this data. It was nice to get the weekly slaughter data back in and all that, and that seems to have continued pretty much on the track we were on when we last got data. Cattle on feed numbers, again, really didn't change things that much. We had the 12th consecutive month of year-over-year decreases in cattle on feed inventories. So we're slowly pulling that inventory down. I do think it's going to come down a little bit faster in the coming months. And, one piece that we had missed in the October cattle on feed report that was filled in November was the heifer on feed number. And so, that's kind of our most current look at least the flip side of whether or not we're retaining heifers. And it doesn't look like it yet. The heifer on feed percentage stayed at 38.1%. Heifer slaughter is down for the year, but so is, total cattle slaughter. So when you look at it, it doesn't look like there's any strong indications yet as an industry that we are aggressively retaining heifers going forward. And so, obviously we'll be anticipating late January when we get the actual January 1 inventory numbers. That'll be the direct confirmation of where we're at on cattle inventories and replacement heifer inventories. But the indications are right now that we have not really change the general situation as far as cattle inventories and where we're at from a herd rebuilding standpoint. I think we're stabilizing at the low level, but I don't think we're rebuilding yet.
Derrell, as we kick off December, any guesses as to what our last month is going to look like?
It's a little uncertain right now because of the sort of turbulence we've been in. We could see some recovery in these markets as we go forward, but again, holidays are always a bit disruptive. Things kind of wind down at the end of the year. So I don't know what to expect at this point. We may just kind of tread water and sort of try to finish out the year. I do think, again, we'll come out with a different mindset in January, and we often do, where we'll see things that really didn't express themselves in December take on a different look once we get into January. So we have to wait and see. On the other hand, the market's been beat up so bad in late October and November that we might actually recover quite a bit if we get a little bit of a chance here in December.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Happy to be here.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing the 2025 Applied Reproductive Strategies in Beef Cattle Meeting with K-State Beef Reproduction Specialist Sandy Johnson. Sandy, thanks for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
Sandy, this meeting a part of the Beef Reproduction Task Force. And before we talk about the meeting, what is the Beef Reproduction Task Force?
So the task force was started over 20 years ago. And at that point in time, in our research and extension efforts on estrus synchronization, there was a lot going on. Things were changing very rapidly as we tried to get toward systems that allowed us to schedule fixed time insemination. And there was a lot of confusion in the industry, the veterinary community in particular, because it was changing so fast. They weren't up to date, producers weren't up to date, and lots of misinformation going on. So a group of reproductive physiologists with extension appointments doing research in this area got together and said, we need to take a collective action. And so that started out with some educational efforts. Our first meeting was in Manhattan in 2002. And from that first meeting, then we said, well, we also need to engage our industry partners as we're trying to share this information and take advantage of what they're seeing in the field. And so in 2004, we had a meeting in North Platte, Nebraska, where the Beef Reproduction Leadership Team was established that include both the academic group and our industry partners. Think major semen companies, pharmaceuticals, those that work in this industry. So we've been working together since then to have uniform recommendations for synchronization protocols, communicate those as clearly as we can. Plus, part of that effort is this educational programs, the Applied Reproductive Strategies in Beef Cattle Workshop that we came back to North Platte in 2025.
At that meeting, what was some of the education?
Well, of course, what's better than a day and a half talking about reproduction? From my point of view, you couldn't have anything better than that unless it was 2 or 3 days. Okay. But we try to cover a wide range of topics. Some of them are maybe more basic, trying to get people to think about how the physiology of the estrous cycle works. So as we talk about trying to control that, you're up to date in not everybody's thinking about control of the estrous cycle on a day-to-day basis. So we usually start out with something like that. And so there's always a good reminder of that basic physiology. And so from there, we talk about various synchronization protocols, how to plan them, use with sex semen, and we get into a lot of management issues, heifer development, cow nutrition as it relates to reproduction. And then we usually have some topics around the male. We spend a lot of time studying the female, but not nearly as much effort on the male. And there's some reasons for that, but we are getting some more data on the male side. And for me, that's maybe the most interesting just because we know less about it. And as my colleagues are bringing new information on that side, it's intriguing to think about because we're focused on the female and just assume as long as we've got a bull out there that passed a breeding soundness exam, we're good.
Were there some extra cool topics when we're looking at males for insemination?
One that I think is very interesting, and I can't recreate it for you here, but Kai Poehler with Texas A&M was talking about, I think it was titled something about the future of sire fertility evaluation. So he's looked at trying to understand the male's role in embryonic loss. We think of that as soon as fertilization is done, the male's job is done. Well, he certainly has some data that would suggest that the sire effect is influencing part of that embryo development, the trophectoderm specifically, but that's not a friendly topic for our audience. But, it's difficult to look at that from a research standpoint, and he has taken some strides at that. And then in some of the work they've done in the meta-analysis, we do see tremendous sire fertility differences even in bulls that pass breeding soundness exams. And that's kind of our best tool right now. And another piece of data he shared from that was they have, I don't know how many herds in their Texas prison system, but they were having difficulty with getting cows pregnant. And they started semen testing these bulls before they turned out, but then also mid-season. And some of these bulls that had tested fine at the start of the breeding season, 30 days in, were showing nothing. And so, what's going on? We don't know, but, we typically are not testing bulls mid-season. And we also know that certain individual bulls can do way more than their share in a given breeding season. And so with DNA testing now, we can figure out who is sired calves in a multi-sire pasture, but routinely we don't have that information. And so there's just some interesting things to think about. We're a long way from being able to apply anything, but we just say that it's not always the cow's fault if she doesn't get pregnant.
And while we're talking about bulls, in an article you shared with me from this meeting, there's a comment about having too much scrotal fat. And what is that playing in the role of getting cows pregnant?
For many species of males, it's important that the testes are at a lower temperature than the body temperature. And so they have the ability in a bull to raise and lower those testes as it gets colder. But if they get covered with fat from a high energy diet, that insulation can raise the temperature of the testis and interfere with that semen production. And we can see, based on certain defects, then that this insult has occurred.
And from this meeting, a lot of great topics covered, but also the launching of a planner that maybe producers want to use.
One of the tools that we began working with Iowa State on shortly after the group was formed is what we called the Estrus Synchronization Planner. And the original version that's still available is a Excel spreadsheet version, and it tries to step you through choices you might make in deciding what synchronization protocol is best for you. And one of the things we wanted to do for years is to be able to, as we've got smartphones and electronic calendars, is to put that directly on a phone calendar. And so we've recently worked with a group that's helped us get over the hump to get that completed. So we now have a online version that allows you to make those choices, and you make your choices, and then you can send that iCal file to your computer or phone, and it adds it to your phone. Now, it doesn't have the cost comparison and perhaps all the other helps that we have in our Excel versions of the synchronization planner. But for many people, that will be all they need is what date is it going to be if I'm going to breed cows on such and such a date. And so we hope with those multiple versions, you find one that's useful to you. The other version that I would mention is that this is such a catchy name is the multi-group version. And what it would allow you to do is if you were scheduling, you have both cows and heifers you're trying to schedule in one breeding season, and it would allow you to put those on the same calendar. So you would see the heifers this week, the cows this week. And, some people are breeding multiple groups of heifers, staggering them if they're a heifer developer. So that version may help some people that breed lots of females, and also summarizes how many supplies you might need of X, Y, and Z, depending on the protocols, and allows you to add things to that calendar. Maybe you're going to add when you're going to give breeding vaccinations or do a reproductive track score. Would also be appropriate for people that were setting up recips. Then they could add into that calendar what day they're going to put in embryos, things like that. So it adds some additional flexibility, but it doesn't fit everybody. So hopefully with those different versions, there's one that fits your operation, and the new version then is available from our beefrepro.org website, and it will also kind of compare those for you if you don't remember exactly the details I'm sharing about the differences. Why that's a good place to go understand that better, as well as where to access those.
If people are wanting to learn more from the Beef Reproduction Task Force, how can they go about doing that?
Well, if you would go to our website, beefrepro.org, we try to keep up-to-date information there. We also have a Facebook page, and I think the way to tell you that is at Beef Repro. If not, on beefrepro.org, you should be able to ask a question there, and it'll come to me, and I'll address it, or through our KSU Beef site, my information is available as well. So,
next meeting for next year is already on the books, and when will that be taking place?
That's right. Next year we'll be in Des Moines, Iowa on November 10th and 11th. And there'll be more information coming about that meeting soon. But how close is it going to be? Well, not too bad for those of you in eastern Kansas to go to Des Moines. And usually we have people from at least 20 states attending any given event. So encourage people to think about that as they're trying to think about how they're going to spend their educational time. And, one time doesn't fit every location, but this was what they thought was best for the Iowa crew, and we hope some from other areas can join as well.
Sandy, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Glad to be here.
That was K-State Beef Reproduction Specialist Sandy Johnson. I will link the resources that she mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show learning about skunks from K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Drew, when we're thinking about skunks, how long do they live?
They are not a species that's going to live a really long time. An old skunk would probably be 5 or 6 years old, but most of them don't get to be more than 2 or 3 years old.
What are the different types of skunks we have in Kansas or have had in Kansas?
We've got striped skunks, which are the most common, and all the skunks that we have in North America tend to have some stripes. So you can't just go off of whether they have stripes on their body or not. But the striped skunk has a really narrow white stripe down its kind of forehead and nose. So that's the stripe that it's named for. And they'll have black bodies typically with the white stripes, but the amount of white and black on striped skunks varies drastically. Some of them will be mostly black. Some of them will be mostly white. We still have a few spotted skunks in Kansas, but they've become quite rare. They're actually a threatened species now. But historically, they were fairly abundant. And, a striped skunk's named for the stripe on its forehead. A spotted skunk kind of has a round dot on its forehead or a round spot on its forehead. But they've got kind of squiggly white lines that run sideways and down the trunk of their body. But they're that black and white coloration too. And skunks want you to see them. That they have what's called warning coloration, which is that high contrast of white and black. And if you have a negative experience with being sprayed by a skunk, then they want you to associate that with their color. And so that's how we're supposed to know to avoid them, is through that warning coloration.
If these skunks, specifically the striped skunks, are only living for a few years, how are they able to keep their population up?
Sure. Well, they're a smaller species. They tend to produce fairly large litters, 4 to 6 in a litter, and they're going to be reproductively active during their first year. And so, a female that lives to be 3 years old, she might get to pull off 3 litters during her lifetime. And so they can replace themselves a good number of times during that life. One of the things that they will do during the wintertime is den up together. So you'll have a male that may den up with several females. 10 to 15 would be a bunch, but that they could den up with that many. And that February time period is typically when they're going to breed. And so that's kind of convenient. A male could breed with multiple females. But there's no male parental investment in this species like there is with coyotes. As a kind of alternative example, the male would breed with multiple females, and then he goes on about his business, and she would raise the kittens. I mentioned a litter's 4 to 6. They've got about a 9-week gestation period. So around April, early May would be when those kittens were born. They're really small, about half an ounce. And then, over the next 17 to 21 days, they would continue to develop, open their eyes, and then after a couple of months, they would wean.
What are these critters eating?
Yeah, so skunks, a lot of times we have a negative association with skunks because of getting sprayed by them, but they're really a beneficial critter to have around. About half of their diet is insects, and a lot of those insects that they eat would be like the beetles that produce grubs that might damage our lawn, or even some crop pests and those sorts of things. So they do benefit us that way. The other half of their diet would be about 20% fruits and 20% small mammals like mice and rats even, that they catch when they're out hunting. And then during especially the colder times of the year, they're having to hunt pretty hard, and that's when they would eat most of the rats and mice. In the spring, they do, of course, eat some ground nesting bird nests, but that's a pretty small component of their diet. It's not as important to them as it might be important to some of the species of birds that they might prey on a nest from.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.